All right, everyone, welcome again. I'm glad to see we didn't lose everyone, and I'm looking forward to a concluding discussion. And so I've asked, it's called a keynote discussion, which might have been slightly ambitious, but I've asked my colleagues up here to take the opportunity for 2 minutes, no bell. I think people will self-regulate 2 minutes. Just to, any comment they had, any observation, any insight, any comparison, anything they've learned, something that stood out to them. And then after we've gone down the line of the table, I want to just welcome the same thing from the audience and have a discussion that we can conclude whenever we essentially run out of steam. And I will cut it off. All right, welcome. Would you like to start down at the end? Yes, please.
Then I said right. First of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this impressive conference, or unconference, workshop, I'm being told. I've learned a lot in this 1.5 days. And I would like to make actually 3 points in terms of terminology used, trafficking, and data that we use in anti-trafficking policies. And then one other conclusion that we came up from the project on demand. So first of all, when I listened to the conference up until the legal panel today, I was thinking to myself, it's such a big difference between what I see to be the discourse at conferences or workshops on anti-trafficking in Europe than what I've heard here. In what sense? Basically, when stakeholders come together and talk about it in Vienna or in Brussels, for instance, there's all the time the legal aspect of it, that is, who decides whether a case is trafficking or not. So you have on the side indicators, right? So there are indicators developed by international organizations, and then NGOs can work with them, and they say there is a high probability that this case, it's a trafficking case. But then who decides in the end whether that's trafficking or not? It's basically law enforcement and the judiciary. So for me to hear so many people talking about trafficking, those were traffickers, those were for sure traffickers, there was for sure victims of trafficking. I was very surprised to hear that, because the way I felt it so far as at conferences in Europe is that we start with the definition, what a country thinks that trafficking is, what a country does to stop trafficking, but is very much concentrated on what does it mean, what do we see to be a trafficker, or whether a victim is being identified and referred. So that would be the first point. And then I have a second point on data. So this being said in the conference as well, and in many other places, I hear the fact that the problem is growing. So we have a lot of victims, or if the victims don't come forward, then we did something wrong that we didn't find them. But the issue that we see with data, and I'm saying that because we've been looking in 2008, 2009 at 17 European countries, and the number of victims identified, the number of traffickers investigated and then prosecuted and then convicted. So basically what we found out then was that, whereas the discourse was talking about tens of thousands, millions of victims in Europe, we found actually thousands of victims identified. So there is very much this idea that this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? And the problem with having data and looking at it and looking at the trend of data in trafficking, right? You say, this year we have this number of victims, which is, let's say it's smaller than what happened before. But if it's smaller than what happened the previous year, for instance, you can say, okay, then the prevention measure that I've done as a state, right, worked. Or you say, I haven't done enough to find these victims that I'm sure they are there. So what can you really tell from a trend where numbers of victims are going down? And it's the same with others. It's the same with the number of cases, for instance, on traffickers and convicted traffickers, right? Sorry, I have to drink some water. So to say that, for instance, you identified or you investigated a number of perpetrators, and then you convicted this number of perpetrators more than last year, basically that doesn't say much unless you look at this data, considering what's the justice system in a country and whether a case takes longer than a year or not. Otherwise, you cannot count these numbers. So I think we have to be careful on how we look at data in trafficking and what does it mean. And this discourse that it's an increasing problem, I don't think it does necessarily good to the issue. So again, connecting with the question that was earlier raised on who benefits the concept in itself and whether you can see that the problem is increasing and we're taking all these measures, basically. So that would be the second point. And the third point that I would like to make, it has to do with one of the conclusions of the project that we did on demand. So basically, when we look at demand in the context of trafficking, we had the opportunity to critically engage with what it means, this demand in trafficking, whether we have a market or not, and so on, how we have to refer to it. You can find that in the publications, basically. But then what we also saw is that a lot of the potential cases of trafficking remain unreferred because they do not fill all the requirements of the definition of trafficking. This is for sure happening in Europe, right? So if you have all these indicators and you say there is the high probability that you have a case of trafficking here, but you cannot prove it that is trafficking, then that's not a case of trafficking, right? So basically, one of the recommendations of the project, also because if you do not have exploitation, you don't have trafficking. Exploitation is one of the elements which very important definition of trafficking. Right? Then, and I would agree with what you said earlier today, that basically one has to look, and I think you named it, criminal exploitation. So the entry point into the problem to be exploitation, and there you would have labor rights, you would have rights of migrants, you look into exploitation, you wouldn't look at trafficking, because potentially the exploitation problem would be bigger than trafficking, because trafficking has such a specific definition that it's very difficult then to say that you find everybody that is affected by trafficking. So basically these were my 3 points. Thank you.
I think it's only fair that I will share with you what I will report back about to my GRETA colleagues, because we always send small emails after we have been to conferences. So let's first share the positive points. I think I've learned a lot about public-private partnerships. I think the US is a little bit ahead of us. The UK has also raised this flag, but they have other problems at the moment, and we have other problems with them. So I don't think they will be the leaders for this on this issue in Europe. So we can really, I think we should learn directly from the US on this. This is really the presentation by Madam Bain, and I've heard about Intercept. These things are really very interesting for us, I think. I was also very much impressed, although much jet-lagged yesterday, about all these presentations about how apps can be used, for instance, by giving apps to migrant workers to invite them to keep a diary and make photos. Excellent idea. I will follow it up. Maybe next year we'll launch it. In Amsterdam. I think it's really very, very good. And again, I think the students in this case and Microsoft, they're ahead of our curve. This was really very, very positive. The third thing I will report back, and you will perhaps be a little bit amazed by or surprised by that, is I will report back, I listened to prosecutors from Seattle and to a prosecutor from Massachusetts. They are turning Swedish now in the US. You may not understand what I mean by that, but in Holland, in Europe, it's Sweden that promotes the criminalization of the sex buyer. And it's hotly contested. It's very much debated. They are spreading the gospel in Europe. They have a special ambassador who does nothing else than telling us that the Swedish model should be adopted Europe-wide. We are not convinced. It's not in the convention of the Council of Europe whether we should criminalize prostitution or not, so we have no position. But you will see in our reports of the last 2-3 years that countries that have turned Swedish, this is for instance Norway, this is also Ireland, Iceland, we always we do not urge, but we invite them, we encourage them to make sure that the possible unintended negative side effects of this criminalization will be honestly, independently monitored. And for instance, in Ireland, the minister has immediately agreed to us when we were there on the mission. You are quite right. I will make sure that we will look into the real impact on the problems. Because there is, of course, for me it's of course, there is, of course, the risk that by criminalizing the buyer, you drive underground the whole market. And when you drive underground the market, actually, it might be counterproductive in terms of protection of the victims, because they might become more vulnerable to exploitation by traffickers or pimps. This is, I think, purely theoretically a risk that should be taken into account. So the official position of GRETA is I very much would like to encourage the prosecutors in Seattle and here in Boston not to be overly optimistic about the impact of their new holistic preventive policies, but to invite universities to do independent research on the impact of these policies, because I have the feeling that they are a little bit overselling and a little bit too optimistic about this policy, what we call the Swedish model. Yes.
I'll be even briefer. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I think it was really nice to see how people working from technology or policy are doing in their own, bubble, part of work that somehow needs to gel together. I guess what was going through my head throughout today was there are all these policy questions, in terms of how things are, how migration is managed, and that link back to even bigger questions. No, the real bigger questions that I think the US is facing, that Europe is facing, are really, this we, this us and them, and this idea that who are we, who are them, who is allowed to come here, who belongs, who doesn't, who's in or who's out, no? And of course, in this conference, workshops, you always feel that it's they are not represented. I think that many times the solutions that we come up with, or the academic discussion, or the doesn't really take into account what really a victim of trafficking needs, and sometimes it's good to just hear from people what they need. And I think that if we don't do that, we make a lot of assumptions in terms of the solutions we're proposing. So that us and them theme runs not just on the topic of the fear of the other and what these countries will ultimately need to face, but also in terms of the policy solutions. And I wonder, and that is, I live with that, which is there space in a world with rampant inequality, plagued by war, but also plagued by all these fears of terrorism? Is there space to build something better in terms of what we owe these people? I guess the question is, do we owe them anything? I think we do. And I finish with that.
Thank you. Yeah, so first, I think a lot of the speakers referred to the effects of policy change on increasing vulnerability of migrant workers to trafficking. And I think that's something we have to be aware of and we have to stay ahead of, right? We've seen this time and time again throughout history, in which, more restrictive immigration policies as well as, border controls, which are now being pushed further and further out, make migrants more vulnerable to falling victims to human trafficking. And so we really need to stay ahead of the traffickers, and we need to stay ahead of the trends. And we need to realize that, learn from the past. And so, we've seen, again, I'll bring it back to Latin America. That's where I focus most of my research. But, you look at the elimination of visas for Indians in Guatemala, right? The U.S. government pressures Guatemala to eliminate visas for Indians. We found Nepali workers or migrants who were trying to get to the United States then obtain fake Indian passports, fly to Ecuador, and then their journey becomes much more treacherous and much more expensive. Therefore, if they do get to the United States, if they're not kidnapped as they're traversing the border or fall victims to criminal groups, then they get to the United States much more indebted and become much more vulnerable to trafficking. Likewise, we've seen, time and time again, how immigration crackdowns force undocumented immigrants into the shadows, right? They have it's almost impossible then for an employer to go out on the street and look for a worker if the worker is fearing a crackdown. That forces the employer to go through a labor recruiter, which again increases the cost for workers and means that the workers are being supervised by a crew leader, right? And so we found a case in Colorado, for example, where this CSA farmer who sold to Whole Foods, and we interviewed workers who worked directly for him. He brought the workers out to sushi. He brought them to a Rockies game in Colorado. He brought them to see Food Inc., but then he recruited the worker. He couldn't find any workers. No American worker had ever gone to his farm for a job. So he had to go through this labor recruiter who ended up paying the human smugglers to bring workers in, and then they had to pay off the debt. They were in a fenced-in compound. A worker fled from Colorado to North Carolina. He tracked him down and pistol whipped him, right? This individual, this responsible communities, this responsible farmer, ended up being charged under RICO for for financially benefiting from the exploitation of these workers, right? And so this farmer gets put in a very precarious situation. I think we need to start also bringing private sector in and saying, look, these repressive immigration systems are not in your interest either. We all know it's an open secret. We need these workers, right? We as citizens need them to fund our pension systems, as other people have mentioned, especially in Europe, right? And I think we need to be cognizant, and they spend so much money lobbying on other issues that there's a labor shortage problem, right? Even just from their own financial perspective, it's in their business interest to have immigration systems that are functional, and it also protects them from legal and reputational damage around trafficking. So the money that they spend on lobbying to try to get tobacco regulators or not have regulations on sugar, right? They need to spend on lobbying and using their efforts to make sure that we have policies that are beneficial to workers and ensure a steady labor flow for them. And then also just quickly touching on victims as well. I think we talked a lot about that label, and I think we keep throwing around the term because it's harder to and wordier to use other terms. But I think that there's a few really important things. So I think one is really looking at agency. These people aren't stupid, right? They're making logical choices under the situations in which they're in, right? If there's a child going alone through Mexico, through the gauntlet, that the situation that they were in previously, whether it's severe malnutrition or fleeing violence, it was worse. And parents make decisions that are in their child's best interest. Inherently, it's universal, right? There are some that exploit people, but in general, you go to any country and that's the decision the parent makes, right? People are lied to. They make calculations, right? They say, this is how much I'm supposed to earn, I've interviewed people and they say, this is what they promised me. They said I was going to cost $3,000 for the work visa. They were going to pay me $10 an hour. I'd pay it off in this amount of time, and then I'd earn this much more. They do the math. They're not stupid. They're lied to. They're tricked. They're deceived. And we need to treat them as intelligent people who through deceit, fraud, and coercion, right, become victims of trafficking. And also, I think the issue around shame is really important. We talk a lot about shame around being a victim of sex trafficking. And that's extremely palpable and real. But also for men, you know, and again, throwing around the term victim, you know, lots of men don't want to be considered to be a victim of anything, right? We like to think of ourselves as strong. And in the same way, people go back to their communities, and rather than, because there's a sense of shame surrounding being a victim of something and being exploited and taken advantage of as a man, people go back to the community and say, yeah, I did really good, and the stories don't go out. So we also need to get the word out and sort of start to make that something that's normalized and isn't something associated with shame. And then there's also just the need for remedy, and to make sure that all of our, you know, all of our research or our projects really provide, you know, empowerment and remedy and channels for seeking recourse and reimbursement of expenses or, you know, retained wages back to workers, to make sure that there's a palpable, you know, benefit of bringing forth their cases.
Thank you. Okay. And following all of the sessions and the presentation from yesterday, I tried to collect some keynote words, some notions that have to deal with the workshop, and I tried to create a small speech about what we all said from yesterday. Thank you. So, Ms. Schilde, Ms. Laurie, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it is a great pleasure and privilege to extend to you all a very warm thank you for this remarkable workshop focused on migration and trafficking, entitled Disrupting the Human Trafficking-Migration Nexus. Undoubtedly, the world has become more complex and dangerous in recent years. Terrorism actions targeting specific European countries have shaken the European security order. Turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa has unleashed a host of challenges, not least the largest refugee and migrant crisis since the Second World War. Adding to that the uncertainty surrounding Brexit and the brand new phenomenon of seeing countries being divided, like the case of Spain recently, and probably Italy will be the next one, creates consequences of which are unclear, and it is easy to be concerned about the future. In this historically crucial point, this workshop comes up with the assertion of development cooperation. Development has its unique place in dealing with the roots of displacement, forced migration, and trafficking. Following the significant increase in the number of migrants entering Europe, addressing the root causes of migration through development cooperation has become louder across the European Union, and several EU member states have dedicated substantial funds to this purpose. However, the increasing overuse of this terminology and the lack of its meaning clarity pose a number of risks. First, development funds must be primarily used to achieve sustainable improvement of the living conditions in recipient countries and not to prevent undesired migration to donor states. Second, the mantra of addressing root causes of displacement may raise unrealistic expectations about what development cooperation can achieve. And third, there is a threat to distract attention from the need to reform European asylum policy, as it is obviously a problem, and to achieve greater responsibility sharing at the European level. However, acute causes of displacement, such as violent conflict or political persecution, require primarily diplomatic measures, humanitarian aid, and crisis management. In cases like this, expanding development cooperation per se will not be able to prevent future forced migration. A comprehensive developmental approach is the remarkable example of the cooperation of NATO in the Aegean Sea, breaking the lines of illegal migration and working much more closely on resilience. Development-oriented measures can offer hope and support for migrants in first countries of asylum, including education and the integration into the labor market with the right to work, freedom of movement, and the right to acquire land. In addition, development cooperation can support the reintegration of former refugees who choose to return home using civil mediation measures in order to resolve conflicts over land. With regard to any of the measures outlined here, it is of course crucial that the local population is not discriminated against but benefits from the measures as well. In the case of violent conflicts in Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, or the African Great Lakes region, involvement of other policy areas such as foreign policy, security policy, trade policy, and economic policy is primarily called for so the world economies can overcome. Meanwhile, host states ought to avoid any trade-offs between developmental responses to situations of forced displacement and the reception of migrants and refugees on their own territories. In conclusion, I wish you every success in your deliberations and your work, as well as a productive and successful outcome of this workshop. Thank you.
So yes, thank you so much for this event because it was very inspiring, and as you said, I learned a lot of things, inclusive about application. I think there are amazing tools, and it's good not to have only expert, or academics, but to have different fields. Yes, in a nutshell, what I can say, I think this. What we're speaking about is everything I think is connected because we're very afraid now about migration. So we're afraid that migration creates criminality. But if we're looking for about all the presentation, it's the opposite. So if we want to stop migration, we create criminality. It was very clear in those days. Because people want to immigrate, for instance, Nigerian girls, they need, it's easier to immigrate through a network, a criminal network for sexual exploitation in Europe than to immigrate alone. It's much more safety with criminal network to immigrate to Europe, for instance. And if we are regarding for the unaccompanied minors in Europe, for instance, it's quite the same. They are considered as migrant, not as minor. And so it's very easy for a criminal network to recruit in an opportunistic way those children who have no future in Europe, and it's hard for them to have a status and to get a job. So we create criminality by that. And I think it's very important to change the mind about migration, because in Europe, all the time we had a lot of migration. In the United States, it's the same thing. In the recent migration in Europe is, the eastern country from Europe. We know that from the 90s until now, we have around 20 million of Eastern Europe citizens who moved to Western Europe, and it was not a problem for Europe. So, and for the United States, it's the same, or it's created by immigrants. And in Europe, we have this capacity of a kind of auto-destruction about this issue of identity and cultural issue and migration in a way issue. And so we saw in different periods of the history of Europe that this space has a tendency to somehow for an auto-destruction, just because of this idea of to be just a single, European, a non-mixture people, and when we face of this issue, I think we are all in danger.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. I'm going to do my job and get out of the way and encourage any concluding comments from the audience.
You get out of the way, and then I take the prerogative to go first, so we're really not inclusive. But I just, I really want to pick up on this point that Hernan made about the politics and the larger system and the question of who's part of the us and who's part of the national body politic, and make a very academic comment that's actually inspired by a reading of Hegel. But I really wonder if there is a kind of constitutive tension between global capitalism and liberal democratic nation statehood. And if you see it from the earliest formations of democratic states, thinking back to Athens, not only was that polity built on a political economy that included slavery, but it also included a large class of the medics who were foreign residents who were disenfranchised and didn't get to vote. Aristotle himself was a medic and not a citizen. And just hearing about these specific industries, sugar, coffee, these are industries that we've seen for centuries inhabited by people who are disenfranchised from the body politic. So we might be actually kind of, as we increase rights of citizens, then it's the non-citizens who start filling these roles. And it might be something that's much larger and structural. So that's my comment. And let's see if anyone...
My comment is relating to the promise of trying to use the data that researchers generate. I would just want to sound a little bit critical, because the present trends that we see in Europe and the Americas concerning the nationalist movement and the kind of language that politicians use do not build confidence. And from my experience working with local people, the moment they don't trust you, no matter what good idea you bring, they take it with a pinch of salt. All the good work that researchers can do, the data that we can generate, the good practices that we can, when political utterances tend to divide people. They tend to build nationalists against immigrants. The resources and the efforts might never bear the fruits. So I think that in as much as we are all working to improve the world because we are passing in it, nobody owns it. The little time that we have as actors on the world stage, we just need to manage it, knowing that others are there and others will come to take it after us. Because when we behave as if the resources that we have, this country, America in which we are, has been developed by generations of people from all parts of the world. So when Americans today think that because they were lucky to be born here, none of us ever applied to be delivered where he or she was delivered. God sends you to a family, to a community, to a country with a specific assignment. So I think that politicians really need to moderate their language. The European parliamentarian told us there the trend in Europe, mass shooting in the US, and so on. Those things don't build confidence, and that's my comment. Politicians need to moderate their languages if they can use the data that we are generating to improve the world. Thank you.
Hello again. So I just had a comment addressed to Madalena on the terminology. I think that beyond the existing terminology, there is also the problem of the political will of prosecutors and judges to use the terminology. And sorry, but once again, I will refer to the French example, but 2 weeks ago we had this conference on THB for labor exploitation in Paris, organized by the CCUM and the City Hall. And the general prosecutor for Paris was invited, and in front of the audience, she explained that she doesn't see the point of using the infraction of trafficking in human beings, because she could just use the infraction of bad labor conditions and help for the labor of someone without a permit, and then a lot of infractions like this. So I think that it does not really matter what we call human trafficking for example, in the criminal code, in the penal code. What matters is also to educate maybe the magistrates. And another example is that in France, the law against THB is really, really recent. And before this law was enacted in France, we only had some laws about bad working conditions and bad hosting conditions. And before the THB law was enacted, judges would never refer to the bad conditions law. They would only refer to the laws on helping someone with no permit for labor to do labor in France. And since we have the THB laws, they have been using the bad working conditions laws. So maybe if we have another law above THB law, they would finally use the THB law. So I think that there is really the question of the political will of the magistrates and also of the politicians to grasp this issue and to really tackle it. So that's it. And also for what Olivier said on what you said on the stigmatizations of immigrants in Europe, I think that there is a need for a general reflection that go far beyond the political sphere and the policies that we implement, but we also have to look at what we are feeding the youth with in terms of cultural material, like for example movies and TV series, because you can find a lot of racism in them, seriously. Even in comics that we have in France and that young people will read. And this is also part of the stigmatizations of immigrants. And we should not only look at what politicians are saying, but really look at the society as it is built. And a lot of people, they actually enjoy they can take advantage, of the stigmatization of immigrants, because they can afford very cheap cleaning ladies and very cheap babysitters. So we really have to tackle this issue as a whole, I think, looking at all the structures within society. Okay, thank you.
One more. Can I respond to that? Sorry.
We're just going to take one last question, and then we'll turn it over back to the panel. So one last.
Thank you. Isaias from CFAR. So just two quick points about what I've learned since yesterday. So the integration of technology into policy solutions. Sometimes, even if you don't have the time or the resources to do policy formulation research at a large scale to influence decision-making in political authorities, I think technology can be really useful in rapid responses, trying to assist people at risk. But maybe the panelists can address the following. One, my sense is that we seem to be a bit surprised when populations, let's say in Europe or in the US, respond the way they do when migrants come in, when foreigners come in. But this is not new, right? It seems to be, for lack of a better term, a natural tendency. So maybe there is a, the territoriality and stuff. So maybe there is some lesson more from behavioral sciences or that area of the field to inform law. My background is in law, but since starting work with CFAR, I've been trying to understand the other aspects as well. So just at the same time, what can law do? What can value-based policies do when the reality is there is a sort of knee-jerk reaction to this? So one of my professors from law school used to say, in law, there is the methodology system, and there is the operational code. So you go to a city, let's say Boston. If you want official blessing, you will ask for the mayor. If you want to get things done, you will ask who's the boss. So, if you're in the methodology mindset, you'll ask who's the mayor. But if you are in the operational code mindset, you ask the boss. They may not necessarily be the same people.
So I think I'd like to invite the panel just to respond down the line to any of those questions. So please.
So, thank you very much for the comment. I agree with you that has to do with political will and with the will of prosecutors to prosecute on the trafficking legislation. I believe that they have to do it, actually, to a certain extent, but we've been working in several projects with prosecutors and police from different European countries, and what I could sense from those discussions were that these people have been working for decades in these systems, and then a new legislation passes, and they have to implement it. And they say, look, I have this area where I worked for so many years. Let me do my job, and I will deliver. I'm going to protect society, right? So they have this feeling that, of course, they know better because they've been doing it for years, for decades, right? So I'm coming, right, a young researcher, and explaining them about trafficking, So I think, but in this discourse now, what I just said, you also have this idea of us and them. We have to, I think about whether who it's not that somebody is right that we have to implement trafficking. Like, what is the purpose in the end? Is the purpose, like the EU anti-trafficking policy says, to eliminate trafficking forever, right? This is the declared goal of the strategy, of the previous strategy, because there is no new one in place. Or the goal is to have a better society. Like, what's the goal? But of course, if you have such a big goal, you're never gonna reach it. So, of course, political will and is necessary, and will to act is necessary, but we also have to think about it that we're in the same boat here. It's not like they have to implement and they have to prosecute on trafficking legislation. Unless, of course, if you don't prosecute on trafficking legislation, then you don't identify victims of trafficking, and they do not enjoy the support that they enjoy in some countries. So, and then, of course, it has an immediate effect of what happens to those victims, right? But then if you think about years in prison of traffickers, of perpetrators, well, it depends what you want to reach. It depends on what the system sees as a success. Is it the number of people in prison, or is it in particular crimes that they have to be in prison? So because deterrence in the law enforcement system basically shows that, and it was said yesterday, I think, that deterrence has to do not with the amount of years in prison, but with the probability of being caught. So again, it depends on the goals that we have.
Would anyone else like to respond? I don't want to force anyone to, but if anyone had a natural response. Are there more questions?
I guess just on the idea of stigmatization of immigrants, I think it's really important, I guess speaking more from the US context, to get some of the stories out here and really flip the script, right? So, if you're looking at unaccompanied minors, for example, in the US, people, the administration increasingly is portraying them as gang members or criminals. What we have to realize is these kids are putting their lives at risk because they don't want to be criminals and gang members, right? They're putting themselves at risk. They could become, you know, victimizers themselves, and they don't want to fall into that. And so I think that story really has to get out there. Also, you know, we in the United States treasure this sort of Horatio Alger, lift yourself up from your bootstrap mentality. And this is what, you know, the parents that come here are sacrificing themselves. You know, I've sat down with people who come here, you know, legally with work visas and have broken down crying, you know, saying how they've left their children behind, they're more indebted, they wanted to come here to send their kids to school, and now I had one person tell me how he had to have his family send him money here from Western Union, from Guatemala, because he didn't have enough to eat, right? It's people who are, you know, putting themselves out there, working 3 jobs, you know, the sort of, you know, glorified American mentality of pulling yourself up from your bootstrap, and I think we really need to get more stories out there about that. And then also just the idea about trying victims for the crimes that they commit as a result of being trafficked. So whether those are immigration-related crimes, you know, I also spoke to people who've been threatened when Department of Labor inspectors actually in Connecticut came into onto a farm to talk to them. They said that they were immigration agents and that if they'd said anything to them, that they would be deported. And they were actually more fearful after the visit from the Department of Labor than prior to the visit. So it's important that labor inspectors, that people who interface with immigrants know how to build trust. And, you know, the point was made just a little while ago, that trust is extremely important, right? For people to open up, for them to share information that would put them in further danger. We really need to learn how to build trust with them. And, you know, it can be immigration crimes, it can be, you know, the illegal mining I talked about, illegal fishing, you know, forestry. A lot of the times, if they're interacting with government officials, it's because they're prosecuting them for engaging in illegal mining or illegal fishing when they're victims of trafficking. If they're engaging with NGOs in fishing, it's usually NGOs who see them as perpetrators of environmental crimes, right? And those are the institutions that have the interactions with these people and the ability to identify them, but rather than perceiving them as potential victims of trafficking, they're perceiving them as perpetrators of crimes. And so we have to really question, you know, and try to work with other NGOs that work in these spheres and have interactions with victims to be able to reconceive of them as victims in this situation.
Thank you very much for the conference and this really reflective conversation here at the end. I think it's been really beneficial. My one comment is just reflecting on the title, actually. The title says Disrupting the Human Trafficking and Migration Nexus, and implicit, I think it sort of means the state disrupting the trafficking networks. It also can be the other way around, that the trafficking networks are disrupting the state. And I think we're hearing the conversation now being critical about state responses, not hearing and seeing the workers making rational decisions back, and how the state has to really question that status quo. I think that is a really useful conversation and direction to take this. So thank you very much.
So just, I think my comment/question builds off the previous point as well. And I think what, I can't remember who brought up in the panel right now, so I was thinking of migrants and people who are being trafficked as agents and people who make these decisions through coercion, but in very difficult circumstances. They're making these decisions rationally. And also sort of going back to Noura's, as you call it, academic point about this tension between the global capitalist economy and sort of the liberal democratic state. I think it's from sort of taking that observation to a more practical, to the practical next step is trying to explore ways in which the rights of migrants, rights of refugees, and especially the rights of those who are victims of human trafficking, people whose lives and experiences are by very definition operating on the margins of sort of the state and the political system. How can we provide them with a political voice? Because what we've heard and what I've observed throughout all these panels for this great conference are that a lot of the issues that we face in tackling these in advocating for migrants and rights and for victims' rights is that they are on the margins and they're politically vulnerable and don't have a voice. So how do we, again, provide them with a political voice that has, there's not just us advocating for them, but all, us as in academics or people in positions of privilege, let's say, but also themselves, and how do we give them a political voice?
I think that's a great question. And one of the things that I'm going to take away from this experience is, on my list of things to do, is to push my comfort zone and work with those who may seem like the other, if it's the private sector, or if it's the academic, or if it's the government, or the state, or whatever it is. Because I think you're right in terms of amplifying the voices of the people who are the most vulnerable. It's up to us who have the privilege to get over ourselves and work together, to say it in a kind of crude way. And just to share sort of maybe an anecdotal story that can stick with people is, a couple of months ago, we did a bunch of research in Malawi with tobacco workers and tobacco farmers on a project that we've been working on for quite a few years there. And it was trying to evaluate what kind of change the workers have experienced as a result of this project. And then we recorded the stories of the workers and the farmers, most of them small-scale farmers, right? But they're caught up in this multinational tobacco market. And those stories ended up, I brought them to the boardroom of this multinational tobacco company. And the people in that boardroom were absolutely affected by those stories in ways that they had never, I mean, we've been doing charts about impact and how many people were trained and how many farmers changed their hiring practices and wages and whatnot. But then, at the moment that they heard those stories, it really brought the whole thing home for them. So I just wanted to share that story as a way of, and for me, I never imagined myself walking into the boardroom of a multinational tobacco company, right? But I also understood that as somebody who worked in the construction trades for 20 years, and then I went to university, it was actually all those privileges that pushed me in the door of that boardroom. And so maybe it's up to us to also consider, just move a little bit outside your comfort zone and see what can happen. Right?
I will actually take up some moderator space then and make one comment, inspired by the last few comments that really hit home, the idea of getting out of your comfort zone, which we often don't do. I think I'm always getting out of my comfort zone, but then sometimes I'm not. So I study lobbying and interest groups, and so I often see corporations and the private sector as the other, because I often see the shadowy dark side of their influence. And so I'm not always motivated to work with that other. I'm more motivated to keep a step back and kind of observe them. But it was something that Quinn set up here about the fact that there's a need for smart migration policies. And the only way states really do things, at least in pluralist or liberal democracies, I'm not going to put too many qualifications on this, but is from interest groups and from pressure from the private sector for what should happen in agenda setting. This is a conversation that happens with business in the United States and in Europe. And one really interesting thing from academic studies is that in a lot of the migration debates the last 20 years, business has been absent as a positive force lobbying for open migration and smart migration policy. There's a couple historical accidents for why this is the case. It's not because they're all bad actors. It's because of, I'm not going to go into the boring long story about why, but for example, at the EU level, it's because they were often just lobbying their member states or in existing relationships with the states and not paying attention to the EU level about where a lot of asylum policies were being set. And so same thing in the United States, where business and employer associations, just for historical accidents, were not paying attention to lobbying and agenda setting. And so it made me think about Christina's network, because her network is very, well, from what I understood from her network, it was very bottom-up, sampling kind of what businesses thought, what businesses wanted to do better. But it occurs to me there's a top-down function there too, about harnessing and, you know, targeting and organizing business to act in their interests, you know, to lobby for these kinds of policies collectively. That would be very powerful. Okay, we are done. That was the last comment. Oh, wonderful. Please join me in thanking everyone here and our presenters in the keynote discussion.